Okay, I want to focus today on the concept of thematic relations or thematic roles or semantic roles. For many of the things that we're going to need to do now, it's necessary to have a pretty good grasp of the concept of argument of a verb. We've worked on this a little bit, but mostly in terms of syntactic configurations. So when you have an argument, where does it go, and so forth. And to start out with this, I want to look at some basic kinds of verb concepts. So we'll go through some different, really basic kinds of ideas that you get that are encoded in verbs, and look at what the concepts are, and then how the concepts relate to something being an argument or not being an argument, and how those arguments are expressed. So if we take, let's take this activity here.
The skin, look at that, the pimple popped straight away from the fact that I'd already done that exfoliation to the...
This is kind of gross, but it doesn't... Did it finish? Now let's do it again.
The skin, look at that, the pimple popped straight away from the fact that I'd already...
So that's a really basic sort of action, right? Which is called what? There's only, is there more than one way of saying what just happened? Someone did something, right? So if we look at what the concept, there's a concept there, right? And so someone did something with their fingers. And so I'm going to go through a way of explicating concepts using this system of basic words. And so using here nothing more than the grammar of English. So things that are part of the grammar. And because you can't really express anything about meaning if you're going to try to explicate a concept without using grammar. So there's the grammar, and then there's basic words here. And the words that aren't basic, the words that aren't primitive, the words that aren't universal, that aren't universally the same, are in capital letters. So that's what the system is. We've used this before, right? So this is a case where someone, if I said, what happened? And you said, well, this person popped a pimple for someone or something like that, right? That's what you'd have to say. But if you were going to try to explain that to someone that was speaking a different language, it's not like that. You have to understand, right, that if you know what the word pop means, you don't necessarily know that that word exists in other languages, and you don't know that you could use what people would say is the translation into another language to talk about this activity, right? Because this is actually a fairly idiomatic thing. So it would be something like this, right? Someone did something with their fingers, right? It's not necessary, maybe, that you use your fingers, but that would be the prototypical thing to do, right? You could use your fingers together with something else, right? But and we could say that before this happened, there was something bad in the pimple, right? We don't know. Obviously, it's what, pus or something, right? But pus would clearly not be a universal concept, right? Well, maybe it is, right? But it's something that could be defined. It's not something that in and of itself. In fact, you would define it maybe in terms of this activity, right? So everything is defined in terms of conceptual frames. We have frames, these things that happen in the world, activities of various kinds, people acting and doing things, and things happen. So lots of these things are going to involve things happening, someone doing something, and so forth, right? And then after this happened, there wasn't. This bad stuff wasn't there anymore, right? That's clear, right? This is what they wanted to happen, right? So this is all part of the concept, right? You've got popping. So another way of looking at it is, how do you know that's an example of popping a pimple? Well, did someone do something with their fingers and cause something bad to come out of that thing, right? And it has to have happened in order to say that. You couldn't say someone popped a pimple if they kind of started doing it, right? We wouldn't say that happened if all the pus didn't come out, would you? It has to, or most of it anyway, right? Something has to, I know it's kind of gross, but it's typical sort of scenario. Okay, so then we have an explication of what popping a pimple is, right? So the expression, they popped a pimple, would be applicable if those things happened, right? Okay, but we have a sort of, it's not the case that this is a completely idiomatic thing, right? You can pop other things, can't you? You can pop, but it has to be the case that you're sort of in the same ballpark of things. If you say, someone popped X, right? So you could say things like, so you say Judy popped a pimple. You could say, you can use a needle to pop a boil, right? So we would specify things if we're going to use other kinds of things, and we wouldn't want to probably do it just with your fingers, right? You could use a needle for it. I think you understand how popping works, right? So you could do it, you could say this other ways, right? Judy squeezed the pus out of a pimple, right? Would mean the same thing, right? But why do we have expressions like this? Or verbs like this? Why do we have a verb pop? And it means what it does. It's because it's a relatively routine thing that you want to talk about, and you don't want to have to describe the hell out of it, right? So you have the entire concept is embedded in a single word to some extent, right? Now, pop can be, you have to also keep in mind that pop has other meanings. So this is actually, we've usurped in order to get this particular meaning of the verb, we've usurped a more general kind of verb, right? So a balloon popped would be, but it's all, so there's going to be something there where something happens and something comes out. Right? That's going to be a part of that concept. But there will be variations on that, and verbs can have different meanings. So this is the meaning of this particular use, where you have a verb used in this way with that kind of an object. Judy expressed the pus from a pimple by pressing hard against it with her fingers. You could say that as well, right? But again, you're just really expressed isn't really it's the same kind of idea, right? You're pushing out, right? Press out, express, but it's too general to be used, or it's so general that it's not used in this way typically. You could do it, but you'd have to add a lot of other things in order to get that exact action. And then here's what the game is, right? We've got nothing but words like this in some kind of a structure, and from that set of words, we get all of that. We get that entire concept, that entire scene comes to mind if we say, Judy popped a pimple, right? And that's only true if something like all of that happened. So that's interesting, right? Because we have to be able to make that calculation, and one of the things we know is that certain parts of that whole concept are what are encoded in the syntactic structure, and that's done in a systematic way, right? So the thing that comes in that subject slot, and I'm just showing here the verb phrase part, right? Because remember, our theory is that subjects of verbs are expressed at least at some level as subjects of the VP. That's the hypothesis we're working with. But that's a regularity, right? If someone did something, then we're going to expect whoever that someone is, and when we can put in different people in that slot, right? We're going to expect them to be, we're going to expect an instantiation of that. And you can see that someone plays itself out throughout the whole concept, right? So there's a bunch of things that are going on. Someone did something with their fingers, right? And then it's because they want, I'm using the they and the their anaphorically here to refer back to someone as in ordinary language, right? And all of that is part of this, right? So there's a kind of actually a very complex concept here that involves keeping track of who's doing what and who wants what and who does what happen to and so forth. And then you have the pimple thing is expressed by a DP in the complement slot. So we have not really very much there in the syntax, but we do have enough there because that's the way it works, right? That by having those things in that order, and we know we can sort of fill in the slot. The rest that we need to have the knowledge of pop when it goes together with things like pimple. Meaning that, right? That's all stuff that has to be in our memory somehow or other, right? So you could say that's a fleshed out lexical entry with the meaning in it. But it's interesting though, because what we really store, we don't really store like the dictionary does, right? Verbs all alone in some sense, right? We store pop with a set of scenarios that it can go with, right? That's the way it works, something like that, and that whole set of scenarios can come to mind. And when we're using language, when we say pop and then pimple, then the scenario fleshes itself out based on probably it's automatic, right? Based on our experience of the world and our knowledge of the routineness of this and the fact that this is something that's highly entrenched in our memory of how things work. Then what we can do, it's interesting, we could make a noun phrase version of the same in some sense, right? We have a noun phrase in which the pop thing can be expressed, the sort of verb can be turned into a noun, and here's one way, make it into the verb plus and then when we do that, the schema is that that noun phrase overall isn't going to be really talking about the pop event, right? But it's going to be referring to what? Person. The person that we find somewhere in the world that equates to the someone in this scenario, right? So it's a kind of interesting phenomenon, but we do get then we can have an expression of the pimple can be there, right? So that would be so it makes sense that we could sometimes consider things within the noun phrases to be complements. We would say big pimple here is a complement of popper because it's a complement of popped in the verb phrase, right? And it's an expression of, and the tests that you would do on it would show that to be true. And it's because, the reason for that is because it's something that's in the conceptual structure of the verb, which can be turned into a noun and so forth. And then you can also have adjuncts and things that would be added to that as well. So we have a concept like this. And we have other concepts that are similar, right? These are really close, right? Not, and in some sense, right? Similar kinds of things, right? There's some hands doing things, and there's liquidy stuff coming out of something, right? So it's kind of similar, right? But we have, this is a very routine sort of action, right? And we have for this a single word that gives you that entire scenario, right? And that single word is milk. And that single word is also the word that is used for the substance that is central to this concept, right? So it's kind of neat. We have single words that all by themselves bring, when they're used, bring to mind this entire concept. Now, it could be different versions of it, right? It's not necessarily the same thing exactly, but they are constraints. So this would be someone did something to a cow. So what we know if I said, oh, that's Judy. Judy milked a cow. What would have to have occurred for me to be able to say that is really what the question is, right? If I say Judy milked a cow, then a bunch of things had to have happened, right? And a bunch of things, so it's just like with the pop thing, and it's actually a very elaborate concept. It's not simple. They did this, you had to do something with your hands. It's not exactly this, right? But that's what the concept involves, a kind of prototypical scenario. And actually, this might not be the same for people. This could be a word whose meaning is changing. But for anyone who ever spent time on a farm where they had a dairy or whatever, right? Then this is the concept that would surely come to mind. And for most people, right, you get it, that when you say someone milked a cow, that this concept comes to mind, right, and no other. So they do it something with their hands. They have to touch the right, I don't know what you call them.
Udders.
The udder is the whole thing, right?
But that, like, you guys, I guess you call it teat, if you want to be technical, but most people...
But that's what they put in the books and stuff, right? But is that what people really say?
Yeah.
They say teats? Okay.
No, I live on a farm and we say udders.
You just say udder, you stay away from the whole question, right?
Yeah.
Because it gets to be it's a French word, right? Well, it comes from French, presumably, right? Anyway, so but that's part of the concept, right? There's this, that before this happened, there was milk in the udder of the cow, and if we know that milking has taken place, then at least most of the milk has to have come out of the cow, right? And after this happened, there's not, right? The milk is removed. So this is a scenario of removal. But we also would say this, I don't think you'd say, no, I don't know, maybe you would if they just said, well, we got to think about the scenarios where you would be getting milk out of an udder. So suppose the cow is dead and there's milk and you know it's got to come out quickly, and so and you're a surgeon or whatever, and you go in and you take a knife and you cut the udder open and the milk comes out, right? Would you say the surgeon milked the cow? No. Because this whole scenario has to be part of it in order to say that. I mean, that's interesting, right? It's not just any old thing that goes, right? And so you wanted this to happen. You wanted to have the milk. You got the milk. You have it in a bucket, and you can use it for other things. It's a whole crazy... This is why we have words that do a lot of work, right? And we have a single word that does this, right? Because we could say, yeah, oh, what did you do today? Well, Judy went into the barn and she squeezed a bunch of milk out of a cow into a bucket. No, you don't have to say it. She milked the cows, right? Simple. Because verbs often have very, very, they simplify things. Big, huge concepts into one thing. Okay, so Judy milked a cow. So these things are similar, right? And notice that in the meanings, we're going to have to say at some point, when someone does something like this to something like a cow, then you can call it milking, right? Because you can milk a goat, you can milk other things, you can say Judy milked a goat, but you probably couldn't say Judy milked a lizard, right? Well, I mean, but it's not like it's ungrammatical, but it's just stupid because lizards don't have udders, right? Or breasts, or do they? I mean, maybe they do. I don't think they do, right? Yeah, question.
So, as far as that goes, because you could have an entirely different word for every time when you milk a cow or when you milk a goat or something. What?
Yeah, there could be a different word for milking a goat, right? There's no limits, as far as we know. So different languages will do different things, right? There's no, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think
But there are particular patterns.
In Portuguese, so it's not the case that you just find the word for the substance milk in a language, and that will yield a concept or a verb that encodes this concept. Not in languages that I know. In Portuguese, there's no word like this, right? It's not the word for milk that you would use. And I can't remember what you would say, but languages can do different things. I'm not sure that there are regularities, right? We expect to find certain things. So when there's a really basic kind of scenario that people do a lot, then if you find another culture where they do that a lot as well, then there's a likelihood that they'll do the same thing. And they can go to the same kind of resources that we use, right? So we just take, the name of the substance, right? That substance, we know it is that stuff that comes out of cows, and so the process of taking it out of cows, we just use the same word, right? So that's a possibility, but it's not something that is a conceptual necessity, right?
Right. The question is just about patterns and what kind of, do there seem to be regularities in the limits of like when you can get a word that specifically is for a particular thing? Obviously, it's more economical if you can say milk.
Right.
And use that for horses and,
right.
Cows and goats and anything that you can milk. Because it's
right.
an economy and being able to
right.
use the same concept over and over as
right.
coming up with a new word for everything.
Right. And but then okay, so that's also interesting that you can also use milk in lots of other ways too, right? You could say, couldn't you say something like there's almost no limit. It's sort of interesting, right? To some extent, there's almost no limit. If I don't say milk plus animal after it, where there's a DP complement, if there's no DP complement for it, then it's kind of wide open, right? I could say, well, the comedian went out there and he was trying to get the audience to laugh, but he just had to milk that crowd for a laugh, right? You could say that, right? Could you say that? But you'd have to say milk the crowd for a laugh, or milked a laugh out of the crowd, or something like that, right? You couldn't say, well, what did the comedian do today? Well, he milked the crowd, right? What would that mean? You wouldn't know what it meant. You would immediately get the image, right? The first image that would come to mind would be something like this, and it would be gross, right? So, because that's the sort of system, right? We have these frames and structures that will put limits on what we can do, but at the same time, we have a good deal of freedom. If we use another structure, we can use the phenomenon. A very common thing is to use metaphor, right, to get to other things. And in fact, that's what we do. So if there's a pattern across languages, they're going to all use metaphor. And they're going to extend the meanings of words in similar ways. And it's going to be a common thing for languages to take the name of the substance, not a necessary thing, and in some way use that that would be a natural thing to do, right? To encode that particular event. But you can't say, Judy milked a pimple, right? But you could say in that structure, right? That's not going to work, right? Even though, it's kind of you're using your hands, but it's not uttery enough, right? And it's not milk-like enough, right? And it's not bad stuff, right? And you're not using your whole hands and all of that, right? So it's far enough away that you're just not going to be able to do that. And you're clearly not going to be able to say, Judy popped a cow, or Judy popped an udder, or something like that, right? Even though, notice it's an act of removal of actually, in some cases, something that you could see as being sort of similar, right?
Without context.
Huh?
Without context.
Without what?
Context. Like you could have a whole bunch of balloon animals, and someone could go over and pop one, and then you could say, Judy popped a cow.
Yeah. If you could. That's right. But you couldn't use it to mean getting liquid white stuff out of the udder, right? It would not work. Okay, so that's sort of what the system is, and you can but it can be extended in various ways. So it's unproblematic to describe this. No, it's going to be a little bit different, right? So notice that it's going to always be the case, almost, right, that any of these concepts is going to be, well, when you do something like that, you can use this word, right? So here, it's not exactly the same in that if you're using a milking machine, then you're not using your hands anymore, right? But the milking machine is doing the same work that your hands would have done. So that's close enough. Why would we make up a new verb just because they invented machines to do the same work? And so you don't. So you could say, the farmer milked a cow with a machine. Or nowadays, machines milk the cows would be fine, right? So the machine is like a someone because it does actions like a someone, right? And does the same kind of work. And so that's just a natural sort of metaphorical extension to this domain. But then we take this, I don't think you can do this, right? I mean, I couldn't say now, the calf milked its mother. Could I, under these circumstances, right? And we don't have really a word for that, do we? Oh, well, we just say the calf nursed. So there's another word. So partly it's So partly, yeah, it's blocked by another word that comes in and is used specifically for that concept, right? So that's another really basic concept, that is, child of mother get milk out of it, right? That would presumably also have to involve the concept of mouth and lips and sucking, right? Because I don't think you could say that, suppose the child, I'm just kind of making things up here, right? But the child's kind of older, right? There was this sort of hippie tradition that mothers would nurse their babies until they were like 5, 6, 7, 8, right? I had a sister-in-law that did that. And then you can imagine, well, Mom, I'm just going to squeeze on it. And then you wouldn't say that, well, the child is nursing, right? Wouldn't be. Then you might say the child was milking its mother, right? Because of the nature of the whole concept. Okay, so we've got lots of stuff like this. So there's in fact, there probably the concept, the big concept there is kind of always in the background when we use a word like pop, right? And then something like this is good enough to give us almost anything, including popping a cyst on a... Sorry about all the gross images here, but we get the same kind of structure, we get the same things over and over again. Something like a pimple is good enough, and that can be a cyst on my back, it could be I don't know what the limits are, a boil, presumably not something like, I don't know, a wart? Maybe, I don't know, warts, what do you do with them? If you don't get liquid out of them, then you probably aren't going to say pop, right? So if you had a little tumor or something, you wouldn't go to the doctor and say, doctor, I need you to pop this tumor. No, sorry. Get rid of this tumor, or whatever it is, right? Tumor me. No, you can't say that. If it was a common enough thing, then there was a procedure and so forth. Okay, so we have we can add things like adjuncts to this, right? But that wouldn't be part of the meaning. So we could do things like this morning, and we know what things are the arguments by the test that we use. So the pseudo-clef test is very good for discriminating what are arguments. What my mother did this morning was pop a cyst on my back. That's fine, right? That means that pop a cyst on my back is itself a subconstituent, and therefore this morning must be outside of it, right? So we can sort of verify these things, but it's sort of conceptually clear, though, that this morning, that's just so, you could add that to anything, right? That's almost never going to be anything but an adjunct, right? But then you get cases where it's kind of less clear. What about with a needle, right? Well, that's not really part of the basic concept. But how do you know? Whenever you pop something like a cyst or pimple or whatever, you're going to always be using something, right? So the use of something is always sort of there, right? But there's a kind of default. You would use hands, fingers, right? And if you're going to add something else to it, so you're still using your hands, but the needle is sort of an additional thing that can be thrown in there. And then you go and you look and you say, well, yeah, that's, in fact, what my mother did with the needle was pop a cyst on my back. It behaves like an adjunct in terms of the syntactic properties, and so that's consistent with the hypothesis, right? That some kinds of things are even when sometimes it's not entirely clear from a conceptual standpoint. So that's why you would go to the syntactic test. Okay, so we can then also do things like take almost any verb and keep the same concept and put it in an NP structure. So here we have the X and Y are the things that are, so the variables in the conceptual structure, the things that you could plug in different values for, are the things that are realized as the arguments. And then we can keep that all constant if we turn it into an NP, milking, a farmer, So a farmer milking a cow with a machine would go into a structure actually that would fit in fine in something like, I saw a farmer milking a cow with a machine. I can't imagine a farmer milking a cow with a machine, and so forth, right? So that whole structure can be embedded in there as a verb phrase with the ingredients of a verb phrase, or it could be turned into a noun phrase with the ingredients of a noun phrase where things correspond, right? So the adjunct is machine. This is an example of machine milking of a cow would be fine, right? You probably wouldn't want to say it that way, but it's fine to do it. And the argument is in this case is realizes a PP. So what would be DP arguments of verbs are going to be PP arguments of nouns, of the noun versions of them. And by default, it'll just be marked with of. Of will have to go in there. Okay, and we could do it other ways. We can have, it's an example of machine cow milking. Would be okay, right? Not human cow milking or farmer cow milking. You probably wouldn't say things like this, but you could. And where again, rather than with a machine is an adjunct on the left side of the noun, and the argument can be on the left side. That's a possibility, right? Within noun phrases in English, under the right set of circumstances. And then you could add on. We don't have the farmer part being expressed because in noun phrases that's routine. You don't have to express any of the arguments, even if they would have to be expressed in the verb phrase, right? We've talked about this already. But you can often, right? And so we could do it like this. Machine cow milking by an expert farmer. This is an example of machine cow milking by an expert farmer. Would be okay, right? It's kind of wordy. But it's a possibility, and the reason for pointing this out is simply that this is something that does happen across a range of structures. It's a very common thing for what would be the subject in a verb phrase to actually be in a by phrase within the noun phrase. And maybe that's just the specifier of the noun phrase, just like it's the specifier of the verb phrase at some level. So that we can have that be the case, right? That if we just use a little bit of imagination, right? The by an expert farmer part, it doesn't have to be there, but it is an expression of an argument of the noun at some level, right? So it can go in that way, but it can also go into the subject slot because we have a different sort of. That's an example of an expert farmer's cow milking. Would be okay as well, right? So we have a range of different possibilities, and in every case, it looks like we can have those things fit into the structure in a natural way. Here we're showing that if you're going to do it with the agent being expressed pre-nominally, then you have to make it into a whole DP, and it has to be that's the structure that we have. We have to put in the DP part of the whole thing in order to make it work. So we have, the key thing here is there's a systematic correspondence, and what makes it possible for us to understand people is that we have corresponding structures with similar pieces. There can be different arrangements depending on whether it's a DP or an NP or a VP and whatnot, but there's still the basic ideas that we've been looking at. Arguments are expressed in specifier or complement position. Which one is going to be specifier is going to be generally determined by the conceptual structure, by what thing is the one that's doing the action. What is doing something, that will be a specifier, right? In some way, but we also have to allow ourselves a certain amount of variability in how these things are expressed, because they can go on different sides depending on especially within noun phrases. You can see there's a bunch of different options. It's not as restricted. The noun phrase has, given the right set of circumstances, you might have preferences for one sort of structure over another, but we have the possibility of putting things in different orders, but all of that is rule governed. So the rule governed nature of that, the fact that universal grammar, the hypothesis would be, gives us possible skeletal structures for things, and then it's fairly easy then to plug the things as we hear them into the right slots in the concept, right? That's the system. So we could do it other ways. Squeeze the pus out of my cyst would be another possibility, right? So we can have things that are more elaborate. We have actually, here we're just using a generic schema for verbs of removal, right? There's going to be something very, very basic, this idea of removing. And because you can say remove already, what does it mean? What does remove mean? Remove is completely bleached of any exact details, right? Doesn't have to be hands, doesn't have to be fast, you don't have to be wanting something, you don't have to be, as just means do something to something, causing it to come out of something else, right? So that's a very basic sort of concept that can be squished on to lots of other things. So squeezed is much more bleached than milk or pop, right? Squeeze just means remove using pressure of some kind, typically with hands or fingers, right? Squeezing is this, right? A very basic sort of thing. So we just add the generic concept of removal plus this, and we get the concept of squeeze, and we can use that for cows or whatever, but it's just not going to be very good because it's too much work, right? But we get the same kind of instantiation of things, right? But here we've got something else, right? The thing out of which something moves would be a z. So there's an x, y, and z in the generic removal schema. You don't have all of those in the milk schema. Why? Why not? In the actual verb milk, you've got the same scenario, right? Somebody does something. Something comes out of something, right? But you only mention, typically, right, the doer and the thing out of which the stuff moves, right? And you don't have to, the other part, there's no z because that's encoded in the verb itself, right? Milk is the stuff by default that's involved but with other verbs you have to specify. Okay, so that's the overall system works something like that. And you could do things like milk the pus out of my cyst, right? You get, it's like, well, okay, you got this. Oh, and she had to kind of work hard on it, and she had to use all her hands, and slowly you got it, or something or other, right? Because we can coerce that into the thing, and we can specify something other than milk. It's possibility, right? But you ordinarily don't, because the default is the substance is given to you by the verb itself. So going back there, we've got I went too far back. What happened? Sorry. Oh, I just want to make you see this. That's all. I didn't really make a mistake on the buttons here. I don't know how to. You have to, with all these builds, you have to go through them each one by one. Okay, so we've got another way of doing this for squeeze, and what we're going to do mostly from now on is use what you'll find in one of the readings that I gave you, and that you find more something like this in the textbook. Usually in syntactic theories, you don't get all of this stuff I just gave you, right? I'm just giving it to you so you understand how it must really be at some level, right? We have concepts, we have conceptual structure. Syntacticians aren't generally not concerned with the details of conceptual structure. All they really need from it is what are the arguments? and what are their basic roles. And there are certain basic roles that recur over and over again. So you might find something that LCS stands for lexical conceptual structure, where that's just the, and they like to do it with these sort of kind of like logic representations, but not really. So it's kind of somewhere in between saying all the stuff that would be ordinary language explanation of the concept, but just, doing it in some kind of mathematical form, because then you feel more like you're a scientist, right? If you can put it in something like that, and so you get, right, because X acts in a squeezing way, and that causes something to go out of something else, right? That's all it's saying, right? Okay, but you can see that the variables X, Y, and Z are in there, and they're in there in certain slots, and the slots that they go in there are going to be related to the syntactic slots that you find. So those roles that occur over and again are what you call thematic roles, right? The things that are typical from typical scenarios. You get the same pattern over and over again, and languages will encode those in certain ways. And they'll do it, different languages will do it differently. Some languages have case marking systems to indicate often aspects of the semantics, including thematic roles to some extent. So here we have we can say that Martha moved the dressing from the bowl into the cavity of the turkey, right? So someone does something, that's the agent. So someone that does something. Or it could be a thing that does something. It can be especially if it's something that you do to something else or to someone else. And that thing that in that slot is called the patient. The thing that has something done to it. So those are the really sort of most basic roles. And if you look across languages, you can talk about, some people do talk about the agent and patient. How are those realized in languages, right? Other people will talk about subject and object, because the subject and object are grammaticized versions of these basic thematic roles. And then the typical thing is that whenever that happens, this is just physics, right? If someone does something to something else, right, then there will be something that results from that. Laws of physics, I think, right? If I do something to a ball, something's going to happen, right? And it's going to hit something, it's going to break. There's a chain reaction that occurs. So something happens, so there's a kind of sub-event. And in this case, what we have is a very typical sort of sub-event would be a change of place. Something goes from one place to another place. And then those things are called, the thing that undergoes the change from one place to another place is called the theme. And you should be aware that all of this terminology gets all smushed up and mixed up and people do all kinds of crap with it, right? I'm giving you the terminology that was, the scenario that was being used when Gruber and Jackendorf made up this sort of basic story, and in the early 70s, when they started using these notions of thematic roles and so forth. And theme, they said, was that thing, then it gets to be hard because you want to cover lots of things with it, but the thing that does the moving is the prototypical theme. And then the thing from which the moving takes place. So if there's a motion, right, there's going to be an origin. You might use the term origin, right? There's an origin and there's a destination. The terminology that's mostly used is source for the place it comes from, and then goal. And all of those. So these are really in some sense, the most basic thematic roles. Because lots and lots of the things we talk about are about caused motion. Motion and caused motion. So you have things like take, drag. She took the dressing out of the bowl, right? She took it out of the bowl. She took the book to the library. So take is actually, the different verbs will put different constraints on what things can be expressed with them. Whether you express the goal, whether you express the source, and how you express those are all things that can vary from verb to verb. So drag, pull. Okay, so the constraints are you only get one of each of these per clause or per verb phrase. Verb phrase will generally be the parts that will give you clauses, right? So you get one of those. There's not two agents ever, right? It doesn't mean that it can't be. No. This doesn't mean that you couldn't say something like Martha and Sam move the dressing from the bowl into the, right? That's one agent that is one agent role that is distributed over a plurality. That's different than there being more than one role. Okay, so that's the basic idea. The patient role is necessarily borne by something involved in by something that's involved in a change of place sub-event. If it's a cause change of place, then one of the items, it doesn't have to, unless this is interesting, it doesn't have to be the thing that undergoes the movement. It can be other things in the scenario, but one of them gets to be patient. And it has to be one of the things that, either the source, the goal, or the theme has to be the thing that's, and then you can add on to this concept things like instrument, like we talked about. And the instrument sometimes will be arguments, but it depends on the scenario and the verb and all of that. And often the instruments are just adjuncts. And you can put in location as another kind of goal, another kind of thematic role. So we can talk about the instrument thematic role, the location thematic role. Those can be arguments or they can be adjuncts, depending on the particular scenario that you're talking about. So there's a bunch of different roles, exactly what the total number is, of which ones do you need, which ones don't you need. It's not entirely clear. And you'll have in the literature people using these terms in different ways and using other terms. And because this is all it's all about the conceptual semantics, right? It's about the concepts and about roles in our conceptual system. And our conceptual system is really, really hella hard, right? It's complex. And there are all kinds of nuances and so forth. And so it's not entirely clear that there are really well-defined categories of things. But there's to some extent, we're going to be talking about, it's common to talk about these kinds of things in order to really get anywhere with syntax. You have to have some notion of how this works. And then you could do tests for them. You could say what Martha did was remove the dressing from the bowl. What Martha did, Martha's the agent, right? Because why? Martha's the one that did something. And if deliberately would typically go with an agent, right? And you could, what Martha did to the dressing was remove it from the bowl. Well, that's going to be the thing that's the thing you're going to put in that slot would typically be the patient, right? And this is a little bit fuzzy. You can't always use this as a way to designate what the patient is, but it can be helpful. So loosen, dislodge, disengage, extract, all of these would be verbs of removal. Remove the dressing from the bowl, extracted the dressing from the turkey. You could do all kinds of things, right? So then the way it goes is that you can say that there's a correspondence between places in the lexical conceptual structure that or sometimes it's called the argument structure. We've just got some kind of a display. We're going to keep the lexical entry simple because we only want a lexical entry that's good enough to get us the syntax. And the way it's going to work is that there are general things that it works, right? The agent goes into the specifier slot. The patient or theme, in this case, this is both patient and theme, right? The dressing is the thing that's acted on primarily, and in this sentence, and it's also the thing that's doing the moving. So I'm assuming that something can play more than one role. So you only have at most one of these roles each, and those roles can be distributed out over pluralities. But you can also have one entity, one of the things referred to in the sentence, that plays multiple roles under certain circumstances. And a very common thing will be for the patient and theme to be those roles to converge on the same thing, right? Okay, so we have a general schema. We're going to have the, here, it's the Y argument is both. The reason I'm saying it's patient and theme is that we think of this as being in case that the agent acts on something, and then that something moves from out of one place and possibly into another, right? And then the source would be typically, so the argument of out of will be the source, and it will be typically marked with a preposition like from. From would be the default, or you can use out of just as well, right? Or away from. Typically, there would often be compound prepositions to give you other nuances about the exact scenario. And so the agent is the specifier of the XP projected by the head. The basic patient or theme is the DP complement of the head. Other complements are PPs by default with an appropriate head. So that is to say, with an appropriate preposition. And the preposition choices there are various ones, but in some cases it's constrained. So a source is compatible with from or out of, most compatible with that. It could be used with other things. But it's actually a fairly tight constraint, and you'll have some verbs that will demand only from can be used to mark the source. And they can be, the arguments don't have to be expressed. You have to express the DP one, right? You can't say, what did Martha do today? Well, she moved. No good, right? Here, because this is such a verb that has to have something there in order for you to even get the basic scenario. But you don't have to put the source argument. So remember, the optionality of a particular phrase in the syntax doesn't tell you necessarily anything about its status as an argument or not. Put would be a goal-oriented event, right? So remove is a source-oriented one. Put wants you to specify the goal, not the source. So we get Martha put the dressing into the turkey. This thing goes from one place to another place, right? It's the other place that it goes to is what you want to have expressed with put. And you can do this in different ways. So other verbs like put would be place, insert. You insert something. You would never say, I inserted it. I want you to insert that from insert that out of the TV. Does that make any sense? No. Even though you might have to move something out of something. The insert concept says, I'm interested in the going into part, right? It's goal-oriented. And the structure would be like this, right? So it's the same kind of thing over and over again, where there's some kind of a to-place would be goal, right? And there's an argument of to-place, and there's an argument of the acting and the being acted upon, and there's a going thing, something that moves. And so that the Y there would be patient and theme. The X would be actor. And the goal would be, in this case, with goals, you often have a variety of choices for preposition. And it's up to you. That's the usual scenario with goals. It's not always the case, but in most cases, it could be into, onto, through, in, on, depending on the particular verb, it will be because it'll depend on what the typical scenario is that the verb brings to mind. Put is very, very bleached, and so it will allow you almost anything as a preposition, right? Okay, so here's the case where we have. I just love if there's blood involved or pus or anything like that. So this is the activity of gutting a trout. You may not have ever done that, but if you've gone fishing and you wanted to eat the trout that you catch, then you typically have to clean it. You probably say clean it, right? But you could also say gut the trout, which means take the guts out, right? So here we have a change of place, but it's a change of place where it's source-oriented, but the source is also what is construed as the patient. So you're doing something to the guts to get the guts out of the trout, but you're mainly conceiving of that as being something you're doing to the trout. You're getting the guts out of it, right? And so the source can be construed as patient. So, and this is going to be the regularity, right? Whatever of the things in the scenario that you've got is being construed as patient will be put into the object slot, the DP. It'll be the DP complement. It'll be the one that's closest to the verb. It's the most central, right? So that agent and patient are the most central things, the most central roles. And so whichever thing is like that is going to be closest to the verb. And it's going to be, stripped of any prepositions, it's going to want to be bare. And that's a regularity across language. It's not a necessary one, but very, very common scenario. Agent and patient have no marking on them, no prepositions or postpositions or anything. And all the other things where there's more the goals and the sources and the instruments and all of that will have prepositions to mark them and indicate what they are. So we've got a scenario like this. And here the reason that the source is the reason that the source can be construed as the patient is that the guts part of it is incorporated into the verb and into the semantics, right? You don't mention that. In fact, you can't, can you? I want you to gut this trout of just its stomach. Can you do that? I don't know. Gut the stomach out of the trout. I don't think you can say things like that, right? Maybe you can, but it's really pushing it, pushing the envelope there, right? If you have gut DP, then intestines must move out, right? In fact, stomach and all that stuff, right? Except for metaphorically, right? You could gut a house, right? We had to gut the house, right? When that would mean you have to bring to mind what are the things that are the basic structures that have to be there for it to be alive as a house, right? And that's the stuff that has to come out, all the walls and the drywall and the bathroom and the whole, all of it. Got to be removed completely, right? So yeah, you can do metaphorical things like that. But again, you still wouldn't do the same thing. I want you to gut the drywall from the house, right? No. Gut the house means to get all that stuff out of there. Okay, so we've got agent, we've got a patient, which is also the source, right? So that you can have different things be in there. And we've got the trout is the thing that is realized the thing and so forth. And you can have goal as patient. So we go back to the turkey scenario. We just pick a different verb. We pick the verb fill. And then we fill the turkey with dressing. The dressing is the stuff undergoing the motion, right? And it's the turkey that is it's the cavity of the turkey that is the end point of that movement. But we still are conceiving of, with Phil just says, look, I want you to have the goal thing be the DP. I want that to be my DP complement. And from that, we're going to get a conception of the event in which the goal is the the goal is the object or patient, and it's going to be the DP and so forth. So we have verbs like inflate and stock. I want you to stock the library, right? Stock the library means put books or whatever that go into the library, right? The library is the goal, but it's also the thing that you're conceiving the agent as mostly acting on, in some sense, right? It's not actually a matter of what's actually happening in the world, but how we conceive of the event, right? Okay, so we got Martha filled the turkey with dressing, cause Y go into, act on Y, causing Z to go into Y. Is the scenario we have agent. The patient is also the goal. And actually, in this case, this is a kind of a predictable thing. We use with, if the theme in any sort of event like this is not the patient, then the rule is you must use, it's not like you can, you must use with. That's completely predictable. So any other verb, stuff the turkey with dressing, stuff the turkey with oysters, whatever you're going to do, anything like that, right? Fill the library with books. Inflate the balloon with helium, and so forth, right? So there are some parts of the syntax of English that are highly specified, highly specific, and we know that we're going to get with, and we don't have to put it. It's optional. It can be left off. You can just fill the turkey, stuff the turkey, inflate the balloons. You don't have to specify what's the thing that's undergoing, whatever, right? So stuff would be another case, right? You could say also, sometimes you'll have choices. You could say stuff the turkey with dressing. Stuff dressing into the turkey would be okay as well, but it would be a sort of slightly different version of the thing. So we have lots of options. You can have goal as patient, stuff the turkey with dressing, stuff dressing into the turkey, and so forth. And again, it's going to be. Am I just doing the same thing over again? Can I just say this shit? Sorry. Oh, here we go. So you have a lexical conceptual structure. Stuff has two versions. Stuff 2 would be like this. Patient theme is going to be the patient and theme is going to be, those two roles are going to converge on one thing, right? And the goal, the agent is going to be in the DP slot. The goal is going to be in the PP slot, and so forth, right? So we get the same sort of scenario over and over again. Now, sometimes it can be the case that you can have themes that aren't patients. So if we say, Sue walked the dogs to the park, we've got a scenario where Sue doesn't really do something to the dogs, right? She's it's kind of interesting, right? She's not, you don't think of that as, well, what did Sue do to the dogs today? I mean, you couldn't even ask that question, right? What did Sue do to the dogs? You'd have to say, well, kicked them, fed them, gave them whatever, right? But you wouldn't say, she walked them to the park would be a strange answer, wouldn't it? What did she do to the dogs? What did she do with the dogs? It's fine all of a sudden, right? Because do something with something, that's a theme all by itself, right? So you see, there are things that play themselves out over and over again. You wouldn't say did, she did with the dogs rather than to them. And you have other verbs like that. So lead something somewhere, drive the car to Chicago. I want you to drive my brother to the store. If you drive my brother to the store, you didn't do something to my brother, right? What did you do to my brother? I drove him to the store. Well, you could say that, but then you would necessarily bring to mind the concept of, I always kill people whenever I take them to the store or something like that, right? Or I have an accident and they get hurt whenever I drive them anywhere because I'm such a bad driver. Then you could maybe say that, but otherwise the default would be no, right? So if we have something like walk, it would have a slightly different. Notice that we have, instead here, we just have someone X acts in a walking way, right? Notice that we don't, in this kind of bleached lexical conceptual structure, we're just using the word walk itself, because if we were to say what it really means, we'd have to put in a bunch of stuff, right? So we just collapse it, it's too much work. We're not going to do all of that kind of thing. But the interesting thing here, though, is that simply you don't have to have a patient. There's all kinds of cases where you don't have a patient. And then you can even go further and have other kinds of scenarios, like an agent that is the theme, right? So if we say, if I say, Bert walked to the park, then did Bert do something? What did Bert do? He walked to the park, right? But it's also the case that Bert went somewhere. There was some motion, right? If there was a going to the park or walking to the park or anything like that, then necessarily whoever is doing that, if you don't specify someone else, right? If I didn't say walk the dogs to the park, then, and even in that case, think about it. Sam walked the dogs to the park. Sam is still a theme at some level, right? You have co-themes in some sense, right? That theme role is distributed over both of those things in some sense, right? Because it's necessarily the case that you have that sort of action. So another walk would just be this, right? X acts in a walking way and goes somewhere, right? And no one else is involved. There's no other entity that's involved in that kind of thing. So here I'm thinking, here you just see Bert's walking, and he's walking in a way that he's got destination in mind. And that kind of walking somewhere with destination in mind would be this sort of thing. But we can also have something like this, just Bert is walking, right? And then we can take the destination out of there altogether. And you have, so these kinds of verbs are different classes of verbs. This one is it can also be just an activity verb. What did you do today? Well, I just walked around town, right? No destination at all in mind. If you're walking in the park, it's not a goal-oriented action, it's just the action of moving through space, acting in a walking way. So it's another possibility. You can have agent, you can have some other really typical things. We have some other, another really basic scenario is where you have some sort of change of possession. Something goes from the dominion of one person to the dominion of another, is the typical scenario. And that can be metaphorically extended to non-animate things, but the typical scenario is that you've got an agent doing something and causing something to change possession from, usually it's a change of possession from the agent to someone else. So you get Bert gave a coupon to Ernie, or in this case you have two ways of doing it. Bert gave a coupon to Ernie, or Bert gave Ernie a coupon. So this is one of the, and it's not really the case that this is a kind of patient, right? What Bert did to Ernie was give him a coupon. Does that sound right? What did Bert do to Ernie? Well, he gave him a coupon. Well, you could kind of force it into there, but it's not the same kind of thing. What you have is something, simply an action. Someone does something, and because of that, there's a change of possession from one person to another. And so we call those roles source. I don't know why. I mean, it seems like we should change the terminology here, because when we started out talking about a change of place, we had an origin of something, right? A location where something is. And here we've got a different kind of thing. We have animate possession of something. And we use recipient for the other person, but there's no other word that we have, so we use source again for this. And it's not really sort of an accident, it's the same kind of thing. And that's why we use the from preposition for this, right? So when in these kinds of change of possession, the person who has the thing that undergoes the change of place originally is the source. The one that ends up with it is the recipient. So notice that this is a very sort of complex scenario, but it's one that is a very important one for the grammar of many languages, because this is, you find this, here's a case where you get some kind of universal constraints. What you get basically, it's really quite saying everything, but what you get basically is some languages that do it like the first way gave a coupon to Ernie, and some languages that do it the second way. Bert gave Ernie a coupon. There's those two ways. And then there are other languages that do it both ways. It's kind of the only sorts of scenarios that you get. And you've got a whole class of verbs that work in the same way. So you have things like hand out, hand over, sell, send, give, trade, sell. And then you have things that are acts of communication that are metaphorically the same thing. Say something to someone. Tell someone a story. Read a story to someone. Read someone a story. So that it goes, they have those same sort of range of options for how they're expressed. And but the transfer, it's not really a transfer of possession, except metaphorically, right? Message goes from one person to another. That person receives the message in an act of communication, right? And so we would use the same sorts of thematic role labels for all of that kind of thing. Communication, transfer of possession, and a range of other things like that. So the structures are, we would say there are different gives. There's give one, and it would have a certain lexical conceptual structure that would be something like this. Someone acts, causing Y to have Z. And there's an agent. A recipient can go in the to. And in this case, so here's another constraint, right? If we've got an animate recipient, and it's marked with a preposition, you don't get choices, right? You don't, it's not like, so that's how it's different from the goal notion, where you can have into, onto, on, over, all kinds of things. But here, no, it's got to be, this animate recipient role has to be marked with to. There's no other option. And then the theme is what shows up. And so this is sort of the default, right? The theme is going to be the DP complement. And to is the head of the PP recipient, but we can also do it this way. Gave Ernie a coupon. So this is called the double object construction. This is one of the major issues if you go and you look at what have people studied in the grammar of English. This crap. Over and over and over again. Dozens of different stories. Trying to figure out, well, when do you do it, when don't you? When do you have double object construction, when don't you? And all kinds of things. So it's the same lexical semantics, right? The same lexical conceptual structure, but you have a different syntax for it. So here the theme is what's called the second object. So notice that there's a restriction here, right? If I've got two DP complements, the restriction is if I've got a verb of communication or transfer of possession, and I'm expressing it with this construction, the construction is fixed. It says if you've got this syntax, then you must interpret it in a certain way. And that's all we're doing is showing what that is. The theme has to come second, right? I can't say, Bert gave a coupon Ernie, right? And again, that wouldn't be, not all languages would have that constraint, but that's a very common one. If you've got two DPs and this kind of double object construction, then the recipient is the one that comes closest to the verb. Okay, so the double object construction is all the stuff I just said, right? You can also have source-oriented changes of possession. Like I said, there's a whole range of different things that you can do. If I say Joe bought a magazine from Carl, then it's a more complex scenario in some sense, right? We've got something going from another person to this person. We've got theme, source, but we've got the same roles: agent, theme, source, recipient, right? But we've got we've got some. We can see what the agent is. You don't really say if somebody bought a magazine from someone. You wouldn't say did something to the magazine, right? Because it's not really a patient role. And the other one isn't a patient role either. What Jan did from Carl, or what was that saying? What Jan did from Carl was buy a magazine. What that shows is that, what does that show? What Jan did from Carl was buy a magazine. From Carl is an argument, right? And we know that's an argument, right? Because the meaning of this, of the word has all of this stuff in it. So we've got then a complex sort of, notice that we've got a complex argument structure here, right? Would be something like this. Someone acts in a buying way, because there's exchange of money and stuff that has to be put in there, right? You only have buy if there's it's actually, so really what you'd want to have would be X acts causing X to have Y, right? So buying is an act in which the agent does something and is also the recipient of something, right? And then, so the agent comes to have something, and someone else comes to not have it, right? That's what's involved in buying. If you were going to give it the full specification, you'd have to say, and money goes from agent to source, right, would be the other part of it that I'll have to be specified to give you the full meaning of. And in this case, there's only one way that you can express these things. The agent and recipient are collapsed into a single, expressed by one thing, right? And this follows a constraint, a universal constraint we have on what the Y can be. The theme here has to be something, anything that's going to be in there will have to be, it's part of the sub-events, will have to be playing one of those roles. And those roles can be in this sort of relationship where you have more than one argument role, and you could say that those are, the terminology that we're going to use here is those are bound by each other, so they're bound variables. And this is something, so we'll come back to that, because where we're going to go next time is to cases where you want to say that variable binding that you can get inside of lexical conceptual structures. And when you have it inside of lexical conceptual structures, then it plays itself out in a certain way. The agent is the specifier by default. The theme is the complement by default. Here we've got the agent and the recipient being in a binding, there's a binding role there, right? The agent is involved in the change of possession, and the theme, there's a binding with the theme and so forth. So there's a source role, there's an agent recipient role, and the thing that is the theme has two different instantiations, right? It's both coming to be had by the agent and coming to not be had by the source, right? So it's sort of a complex scenario. So that's basically the story for thematic roles. So what we've gone through sort of all of the main ones. What we're going to do next time is start to look at cases where you're going to sort of need this knowledge. You're going to have to know what are the arguments that a verb has, because what we're going to find is cases where the arguments that you have, that a verb has, are in some very, very particular syntactic constructions not expressed. And so what you get then is a scenario of this sort of bind.